in a desert to heat up the sun and the sand. That's why we're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why, Lord. Say we are suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. Cause when our people are oppressed, I know they've got to revolt. That's why it takes a revolution to bring about solution. But still we're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why, Lord. Say we are suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. They took us away from our fertile land, bring us in Sahara to heat up the sun and the air. I try so hard to forget, but still I always remember about the Great Guinea Massacre and the voyage of African slaves. And so we're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. They are the cause of it. We're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. We say we're suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering, and they know why. We are suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering, and they know why. I try so hard to forget, but still I always remember about the Great Guinea Massacre and the voyage of African slaves. Still we're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. They are the cause of it. We are suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. We're suffering, we're suffering. We're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why, Lord. Say we are suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why. We're suffering and suffering and suffering, and they know why, Lord. We are suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering and suffering, and they know why. We're suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering, and they know why. We're suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering, and they know why. We are suffering, we're suffering, we're suffering.